The frozen river stretched like a silver blade through the Colorado wilderness, its surface gleaming under the pale February sun. Victoria Martinez had been tracking the elk herd for 3 hours, her breath forming white clouds in the bitter air as she moved silently through the snow-laden pines. At 28, she was one of the few wildlife biologists willing to venture this deep into the backcountry during winter, but the migration patterns she was documenting could change everything. They knew about the region's ecosystem. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She paused at the river's edge, pulling out her field notebook. With gloved hands, the ice looked solid enough, at least 2 feet thick by her estimation, but something was wrong. A dark shape moved beneath the frozen surface, and then she heard it. A muffled cry that made her blood run cold. 50 yards downstream, a section of ice had given way. A young girl, no more than 15, thrashed desperately in the freezing water, her long black hair plastered against her face as she fought to keep her head above the surface. Her traditional Apache dress, heavy with water, was dragging her down. Victoria didn't hesitate. She dropped her pack and sprinted across the ice, her boots finding purchase on the rough surface. The girl's movements were growing weaker, hypothermia, setting in fast in water that couldn't be more than 34 degrees. "Hold on!" Victoria shouted, throwing herself onto her stomach as she reached the break in the ice. The girl's dark eyes met hers, wide with terror, but still fierce with the will to live. Victoria grabbed a fallen branch and extended it toward the water. "Take it! Grab the branch!" The girl's fingers, blue with cold, wrapped around the wood. Victoria pulled, using every ounce of strength she had, feeling the ice crack ominously beneath her own weight. The girl was small, but waterlogged clothing made her heavy. Victoria dug her boots into the ice and hauled backward, inch by precious inch. When the girl finally collapsed onto solid ice, Victoria immediately began stripping off her own coat. Hypothermia could kill faster than drowning in these conditions. She wrapped the girl in her fleece-lined jacket and picked her up, surprised by how light she actually was beneath all that wet fabric. "What's your name?" Victoria asked as she carried the girl toward shore. "Ayana," the girl whispered through chattering teeth. "Ayana Crow Feather." Victoria's mind raced. She knew that name, or rather, that surname. The Crow Feather family was part of the Northern Apache band that had traditional hunting grounds in this area. But what was a 15-year-old girl doing out here alone, dressed in ceremonial clothing in the middle of winter? Back at her truck, Victoria cranked the heat to maximum and helped Ayana out of her wet clothes, wrapping her in emergency blankets from her first aid kit. The girl's lips were still blue, but her shivering was a good sign. It meant her body was still fighting the cold. "We need to get you to a hospital," Victoria said, starting the engine. "No." Ayana's voice was stronger now, more determined. "No hospitals, please. You nearly died. You need medical attention. I can't go back." Tears mixed with melted ice on Ayana's cheeks. "They'll make me marry him. That's why I was at the river. I was trying to purify myself before I ran away." Victoria studied the girl's face in the rearview mirror. There was something ancient in those dark eyes, a wisdom that seemed too old for 15 years. But there was also fear. Real, desperate fear. "Who were you supposed to marry?" "Thomas Whitehorse. He's 43 years old and has 2 wives already. My grandfather arranged it." Ayana pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "I went to the sacred pool where my grandmother used to pray. I thought maybe the spirits would show me another way. But the ice, it looked so solid." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Arranged marriages weren't uncommon in some traditional communities, but 43 to 15 was something else entirely. And if the girl had been desperate enough to venture onto unstable river ice— "Where do you live?" "The reservation is 30 miles north. But please, I can't go back there. Not yet. Victoria made a decision that would change both their lives. My cabin is 10 miles from here. We'll go there first, get you properly warmed up and fed. Then we'll figure out what to do. The drive to Victoria's cabin was quiet, except for the rumble of the truck's heater. Ayana stared out the window at the passing forest, and Victoria found herself stealing glances at the girl in her mirror. There was something almost ethereal about her, the high cheekbones, the way she held herself despite everything she'd been through. She looked like she'd stepped out of an old photograph, a remnant of a world that was rapidly disappearing. Victoria's cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering ponderosa pines. It was modest but well built, with solar panels on the roof and a stone chimney that promised warmth. She'd bought it 3 years ago when she'd taken the job with the Forest Service, needing a place where she could work without the distractions of town life. Inside, Victoria got a fire going in the stone fireplace, while Ayana sat wrapped in blankets on the leather couch. The cabin was simple but comfortable. Knotty pine walls, lined with bookshelves, Native American pottery and artwork that Victoria had collected over the years, and large windows that looked out onto the forest. "You know our traditions," Ayana observed, nodding toward a dream catcher hanging near the window. "I've worked with several tribes over the years. Your people taught me a lot about the land, about reading the signs that animals leave behind." Victoria handed her a mug of hot tea. "That's actually how I knew where to find the elk herd today, and that's how you happened to be at the river when I fell through." Victoria paused. She hadn't thought about it that way, but the girl was right. If she hadn't been tracking that particular herd, if she hadn't taken that exact route to the river, I guess so. My grandmother would say, the spirits led you there. She believed everything happens for a reason. They sat in comfortable silence. For a while, watching the flames dance in the fireplace, Victoria found herself thinking about her own grandmother, who had died when Victoria was about Ayana's age. She'd been the one who'd encouraged Victoria's love of the outdoors, who'd taught her that the natural world had its own wisdom if you knew how to listen. "Tell me about your grandmother," Victoria said. Ayana's face softened. "She was a medicine woman. People came from all over to seek her counsel. She knew which plants could heal, which ceremonies could bring rain, how to read the future in the flight patterns of birds. She died 2 years ago. I'm sorry. She was the only one who understood. The only one who thought I could be more than just a wife and mother." Ayana's voice grew bitter. "After she died, my grandfather became different. More traditional," he said. "More concerned with honor and old ways. But he picked the old ways that suited him and ignored the ones that didn't." "What? Do you mean? In the old days, women had power. They chose their own husbands, owned property, made decisions for the tribe. My grandmother told me stories of Apache women who were warriors, medicine women, leaders. But my grandfather only remembers the parts about obedience and duty." Victoria nodded. She'd seen this tension in other communities, the struggle between preserving tradition and adapting to modern realities, often played out on the backs of young women caught between worlds. "What would you do if you could choose?" Victoria asked. For the first time since the rescue, Ayana smiled. "I'd go to college, study environmental science like you. I want to help protect the sacred places, the ones that developers want to destroy. I want to be like my grandmother, but for the modern world, someone who bridges the old knowledge and the new." Victoria felt something stir in her chest. Recognition, maybe, or kinship. "That's exactly why I became a biologist. To protect the places that can't protect themselves. But I'm just a 15-year-old Indian girl with no money and a grandfather who thinks education makes women dangerous. You're a 15-year-old Apache woman who survived falling through river ice and has the courage to fight for her future. That's not nothing." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Do you really think I could do it? Go to college, I mean?" I think you could do anything you set your mind to, but first, we need to figure out how to keep you safe. As if on cue, a low rumble echoed through the forest. Victoria moved to the window and peered out through the gathering dusk. Headlights flickered between the trees, multiple vehicles moving slowly up the mountain road toward her cabin. Ayana joined her at the window, and Victoria felt the girl's body tense beside her. "That's them," Ayana whispered. "That's my grandfather's truck." Victoria counted at least 4 vehicles, maybe more behind them. This wasn't just a concerned family looking for a missing girl. This was something else entirely. How did they find us so fast? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My grandfather is a tracker. He taught me how to read signs in the forest, but he's better than I'll ever be. And he has friends, other men from the tribe, who think like he does about the old ways. The truck stopped at the tree line, their engines cutting off one by one. In the sudden silence, Victoria could hear car doors slamming, and the crunch of boots on snow. Men's voices, low and serious, drifted through the cold air. "They won't hurt you," Ayana said, but her voice was uncertain. "My grandfather isn't violent, but he's determined, and he has influence. If he says I have to marry Thomas Whitehorse, people listen." Victoria moved away from the window and began checking the locks on her doors. The cabin was solid, built to withstand mountain winters, but it wasn't a fortress, and she was one person against what looked like half a dozen men or more. "There has to be another way out of this," Victoria murmured, her mind racing through possibilities. "There is," Ayana said quietly. "I go with them. I marry Thomas. I forget about college and dreams and everything my grandmother taught me about being strong. That's not happening. You don't understand. My grandfather is Samuel Crow Feather. He's not just an elder. He's the tribal council leader. He has power beyond the reservation. People owe him favors. And he believes he's doing what's best for me, for our people." Victoria looked at the girl, really looked at her. Ayana stood straighter now, despite the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. The fear was still there, but so was something else. Resolve, maybe. Or perhaps just the stubborn strength that had kept her fighting in that freezing water. "Your grandmother believed in your strength," Victoria said. "She taught you about Apache women who were warriors and leaders. What would she tell you to do right now?" Ayana closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them they were clear and determined. "She'd tell me to fight, not with weapons, but with wisdom. She'd tell me to find another way." The sound of footsteps on the cabin's front porch made them both freeze. A knock echoed through the room, not aggressive, but firm and unmistakably authoritative. Victoria took a deep breath and walked to the door. Whatever was about to happen, she and Ayana would face it together. Victoria opened the door to find a tall, weathered man in his 70s standing on her porch. Samuel Crow Feather commanded presence even in stillness. Silver hair braided down his back, deep lines carved into bronzed skin, and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. Behind him stood 5 other men, ranging from middle-aged to elderly, all wearing the same expression of grim determination. "Ms. Martinez," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned over decades. "I believe you have something that belongs to my family." "I have a guest who nearly died in your river," Victoria replied, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "She's warming up by the fire." "My granddaughter has a tendency toward dramatics. She's needed at home." "Your granddaughter has frostbite and hypothermia. She needs medical attention, not whatever you have planned for her." Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't understand our ways, Ms. Martinez. Ayana has responsibilities to her people, to her family. A marriage has been arranged that will strengthen our community. A marriage to a man nearly 3 times her age, who already has 2 wives. That's not strengthening anything, that's destroying a young woman's future. The man standing to Samuel's right, shorter and broader, with greying hair and a permanent scowl, stepped forward. "You have no right to interfere in tribal matters, white woman. Give us the girl." "Frank Redbird, enough," Samuel said quietly, but his companion didn't back down. "No, Samuel. This outsider thinks she knows better than our elders, better than our traditions. She's filling Ayana's head with modern nonsense." Victoria felt her temper flare. "Modern nonsense like the right to choose her own future, like getting an education? Your traditions seem awfully selective." "Careful," Samuel warned, his voice carrying a new edge. "You're speaking about things you don't understand." "Then help me understand. Explain to me how forcing a 15-year-old girl into marriage with a middle-aged man honors your ancestors." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind through the pines. Victoria could feel the tension radiating from the men behind Samuel, and she realized she was walking a dangerous line. But Ayana was listening from inside the cabin, and the girl needed to know someone would fight for her. "May I come in?" Samuel asked finally. "Perhaps we can discuss this like civilized people." Victoria hesitated, then stepped aside. Samuel entered alone, his presence seeming to fill the small cabin. His eyes immediately found Ayana, who stood by the fireplace wrapped in blankets, her chin raised defiantly, despite the fear Victoria could see in her posture. "Granddaughter," Samuel said, his voice softer now, "you've caused a great deal of worry." "I've caused worry." Ayana's voice shook with anger. "I nearly died today because I was so desperate to escape the life you've planned for me." "The life I've planned will give you security, children, a place in our community. Thomas Whitehorse is a good provider. Thomas Whitehorse is older than my father would have been. He treats his current wives like servants, and you know this, grandfather. You know it, and you don't care." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I care about what's best for our people. Mixed marriages weaken our bloodlines. Modern education fills young minds with ideas that destroy families. Look at your cousin Maria. Went to college, married a white man, moved to Phoenix. When did she last visit the reservation? When did she last participate in our ceremonies? Maybe because people like you made her feel unwelcome when she tried to bring new ideas home." Ayana shot back. Victoria watched the exchange, recognizing the pain beneath both their anger. This wasn't just about tradition versus modernity. It was about a grandfather terrified of losing his granddaughter to a world he didn't understand, and a girl desperate to honor her heritage while still claiming her own destiny. "Samuel," Victoria said quietly, "what if there was another way?" Both sets of eyes turned to her. Samuel's expression was skeptical, but she caught something else there, a flicker of hope maybe, or at least curiosity. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Ayana wants to study environmental science. She wants to protect the sacred places, the traditional hunting grounds, the water sources. How is that not serving your people?" College corrupts. College educates. It gives her tools to fight the developers who want to build resorts on your sacred mountains. It gives her the knowledge to protect the rivers where your ancestors performed ceremonies. It gives her power to preserve your culture, not destroy it. Samuel looked at his granddaughter, who was watching him with desperate hope. "And marriage? Children, the continuation of our family line, can happen when she's ready," Victoria said, "when she chooses. Your ancestors didn't force 15-year-old girls into marriages with men 3 times their age. You presume to know our history." "I know enough. I know that Apache women historically had significant power in choosing their mates. I know that many Apache societies were matrilineal. Children belonged to their mother's clan, not their father's. I know that women could initiate divorce and own property, The surprise on Samuel's face was quickly masked, but not before Victoria saw it. "You've studied our ways. I've worked alongside your people for years. I've learned from Apache guides, historians, medicine women, including your wife before she passed." Samuel's composure cracked slightly. "You knew Eleanor?" "Eleanor Crowfeather taught me to read animal signs, to understand which plants indicated healthy watersheds. She also told me stories about her grandmother, who was a warrior woman who fought alongside Geronimo." "Eleanor talked too much," Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor was proud of her heritage, all of it, including the parts about strong women who fought for their people's survival. Ayana stepped forward, the blankets falling away to reveal she'd changed into some of Victoria's spare clothes. "Grandmother told me those same stories, grandfather. She said I had the same fire in me that burned in our warrior women. She said that fire was meant to protect our people, not be extinguished by an unwanted marriage." Samuel aged 10 years in that moment. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since arriving, he looked uncertain. "Eleanor filled your head with dreams that can't be fulfilled. The world doesn't want Apache women to be warriors anymore." "The world needs Apache women to be warriors more than ever," Victoria said. "But the battles are different now. They're fought in courtrooms and environmental impact hearings and research labs. They're fought with degrees and knowledge and legal expertise. And if she fails, if she goes to this college and can't survive in the white world, if she comes back broken or changed or never comes back at all," the question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Victoria realized this was the heart of Samuel's fear, not losing Ayana to marriage, but losing her to a world that might not value what she was, might not recognize the strength she carried. "Then she comes home," Victoria said simply, "but she comes home with tools to help her people. And if she succeeds, when she succeeds, she becomes exactly what Eleanor said she could be, a warrior for your people in the modern world." Outside, voices were growing restless. Frank Redbird's voice carried through the window. "Samuel's been in there too long. The girl is bewitching him like she did the white woman." Samuel heard it too, and his expression hardened again. "My people expect me to bring Ayana home tonight. Thomas Whitehorse has already paid the bride price. Preparations for the ceremony have begun." "Then stop them," Ayana said desperately. "Tell them the marriage is off. I can't just—" "You're the tribal council leader. If you can't stop an unwanted marriage, who can?" Samuel began pacing the small cabin, his internal struggle visible in every step. "It's not that simple. Thomas has influence, connections beyond the reservation. His family has money, political power. Refusing this marriage would create enemies I can't afford to make." "So, you'll sacrifice your granddaughter to keep the peace?" Victoria's voice was sharp with disbelief. "I'll protect my people the best way I know how. By selling a 15-year-old girl. By ensuring our community's survival." The shout seemed to surprise Samuel himself. He stopped pacing and looked at both women, his granddaughter staring at him with hurt and betrayal, Victoria with barely contained fury. "You think I enjoy this?" Samuel's voice dropped to a whisper. "You think I want to see Ayana in a marriage that will dim her fire? But I have to think about everyone, not just one girl's dreams." "What about thinking about what's right?" Ayana asked, tears finally spilling over. "What about the values Grandmother taught us? What about justice and honor and protecting the innocent?" "The innocent?" Samuel laughed bitterly. "Child, there are no innocent people in the adult world. There are only people making impossible choices with consequences they can't foresee." Victoria moved to stand beside Ayana, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "Then make a different choice. Be the grandfather Eleanor would want you to be." Samuel looked at them both for a long moment, then walked to the window and stared out at his companions, waiting in the cold. Thomas Whitehorse won't accept a refusal easily. He'll see it as an insult to his honor, his family's honor. He has friends in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, connections to people who could make life very difficult for our reservation. So we make it difficult for him first, Victoria said. We? Ayana's not the only one with fire, Samuel. I've spent years documenting environmental violations, political corruption, illegal development on federal lands. If Thomas Whitehorse has been cutting corners or bending rules to build his influence, I can find it. Samuel studied her with new interest. You'd risk your career to help a girl you met today. I'd risk my career to stop a child from being sold into marriage. That's not even a question. The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted them. Frank Redbird's voice called through the door. Samuel, the men are getting cold. Bring the girl out now, or we're coming in. Samuel looked between Victoria and Ayana, his weathered face a map of conflicting emotions. If I walk out that door without you, he said to his granddaughter, I may not be able to protect you from what follows. And if I walk out that door with you, I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I'd been brave enough to drown in that river. The stark honesty of Ayana's words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He closed his eyes and seemed to age another decade in the span of a breath. There's something else, Victoria said quietly. Something you should know before you make your decision. Both Samuel and Ayana looked at her. I've been documenting environmental changes in this region for 3 years. The water table is dropping, the wildlife migration patterns are shifting, and the traditional hunting grounds are showing signs of contamination. Your people are going to face challenges in the next decade that will make current political problems look simple. What does that have to do with Ayana's marriage? Everything. You need people who understand both worlds, who can speak to government agencies and environmental groups, who can navigate federal law and tribal sovereignty issues, who can protect your sacred sites using modern legal tools. You need exactly what Ayana could become. Samuel was quiet for so long that Victoria began to wonder if he'd heard her. Finally, he spoke. Eleanor used to say that the spirits sometimes speak through unexpected voices. What did she mean? That wisdom doesn't always come from elders or tradition. Sometimes it comes from young people who see clearly because they haven't learned to look away from difficult truths yet. He turned to face his granddaughter directly. Ayana, if I were to refuse this marriage, if I were to risk everything to give you the chance to pursue this education, what would you promise me in return? Ayana's eyes widened with the first real hope Victoria had seen in them. I'd promise to come back, to use everything I learned to help our people, to never forget who I am or where I come from. And if the white world tries to change you, if they try to make you ashamed of your heritage, then I'll remember grandmother's stories about warrior women who never backed down from a fight. Samuel nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision that surprised even him. And Ms. Martinez, if I were to trust you with my granddaughter's future, what would you promise me? Victoria felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. I'd promise to help her succeed, to make sure she gets the education and opportunities she needs, and to make sure she never loses touch with her roots. That's a large promise from someone who barely knows us. Some promises are worth making to strangers, especially when those strangers might become family. The words surprised Victoria as much as they seemed to surprise Samuel, but looking at Ayana, at this fierce, intelligent girl who'd nearly died rather than surrender her dreams, Victoria knew she meant every word. Samuel walked back to the window and looked out at his waiting companions. They won't understand. Frank Redbird especially. He's Thomas Whitehorse's cousin. This decision will split the community. Then it's time your community had something worth splitting over, Victoria said. Samuel turned back to them, and for the first time since arriving, he smiled. It was a small, sad smile, but it transformed his entire face. Eleanor would have liked you, Ms. Martinez. She always said the best allies were the ones who chose to fight for justice rather than being born to it. Does that mean? Ayanna couldn't finish the question. Hope and fear were warring in her voice. It means, Samuel said, straightening his shoulders and walking toward the door, that your grandfather is about to have a very difficult conversation with some very angry men. Samuel stepped onto the porch, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid mountain air. The 5 men waiting for him had stamped paths in the snow, their patience clearly wearing thin. Frank Redbird stood closest to the door, his arms crossed, and his weathered face set in disapproval. About time, Frank growled. Where's the girl? She's staying here tonight, Samuel said quietly. The words hit the group like a physical blow. Frank's mouth fell open while the other men exchanged confused glances. Robert Silverberg, Thomas Whitehorse's brother-in-law, stepped forward. What? Do you mean staying here? Samuel, we came to bring Ayanna home. The ceremony is in 3 days. There won't be a ceremony. Frank's face flushed red despite the cold. Have you lost your mind? Thomas has already sent invitations, paid for the feast, bought ceremonial gifts. You can't just... I can and I am. Samuel's voice carried the authority of decades of leadership, but Victoria could hear the uncertainty beneath it through the cabin window. The marriage is off. This is that white woman's doing, Frank spat, pointing toward the cabin. She's poisoned your mind against our ways, filled Ayanna's head with modern garbage about women's rights and education. My mind is my own, Frank, as is my decision. James Whitefeather, the oldest of the group besides Samuel, cleared his throat. Samuel, we've been friends for 40 years. Talk to me. What's really happening here? Samuel looked at his old friend, and some of the tension left his shoulders. Ayanna nearly died today, James. She was so desperate to avoid this marriage that she walked onto unstable ice. Would have drowned if Ms. Martinez hadn't been there. Young. People are dramatic, Robert said dismissively. She would have gotten over it once she settled into married life. Would she? Or would we have watched her spirit die a little more each day, until there was nothing left of the granddaughter Eleanor? Raised? Frank stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Eleanor filled that girl's head with stories about warrior women and female power. Eleanor forgot her place, and now Ayanna thinks she can forget hers too. The crack of Samuel's palm against Frank's cheek echoed through the forest. The smaller man staggered backward, his hand flying to his face in shock. Don't you ever speak about my wife that way again, Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet. Eleanor was worth 10 of you, and her memory deserves respect. Inside the cabin, Victoria felt Ayanna tense beside her. The girl pressed closer to the window, trying to hear every word of the confrontation outside. Frank rubbed his cheek, his eyes blazing with humiliation and rage. You've lost your way, old man. This white woman has bewitched you just like she bewitched Ayanna. Thomas isn't going to accept this insult quietly. Then Thomas can take his concerns up with me directly. Oh, he will, Robert said, pulling out his cell phone. In fact, I think I'll call him right now. Samuel watched as Robert dialed, his expression grim but determined. Victoria could see the cost of his decision written in every line of his face. Friendships ending, community divisions opening, political consequences that might last for years. Thomas? Robert said into the phone. It's Robert. We have a problem. Samuel is refusing to honor the marriage contract. No, she's not injured. She's fine. She's just being difficult, and Samuel is enabling it. Yes, I'll put him on. Robert held out the phone to Samuel. Thomas wants to speak with you. Samuel took the phone reluctantly. Thomas. Even through the cabin window, Victoria could hear the angry voice on the other end of the line, though she couldn't make out specific words. Samuel listened for nearly a minute before responding. The girl doesn't want the marriage, Thomas. I won't force her, more angry, shouting from the phone. The bride price will be returned in full. The voice on the phone grew even louder. I understand your position, Thomas. I hope you'll understand mine. Samuel handed the phone back to Robert, who listened for a moment before hanging up. Thomas is coming here, Robert announced, tonight with his sons and his brothers. He says you've dishonored his family and broken sacred trust between clans. How many men is he bringing? James asked quietly. 12, maybe 15, plus vehicles and... Robert hesitated. And what? And he mentioned calling his contacts in federal law enforcement. Said something about kidnapping charges against the white woman. Victoria's blood ran cold. Through the window, she saw Samuel's shoulders sag as the full implications hit him. He can't prove kidnapping, Samuel said. But he sounded uncertain. Can't. Frank said with ugly satisfaction. White woman takes Apache girl from tribal land, refuses to return her to her family, interferes with tribal marriage customs. Thomas has friends in the FBI who specialize in reservation crimes. They might be very interested in this story. Ayanna grabbed Victoria's arm. They could arrest you, take you away, and then I'd have no protection at all. Victoria's mind raced through possibilities. Federal kidnapping charges would mean prison time, career destruction, her entire life ruined. But looking at Ayanna's terrified face, she knew she couldn't back down now. We need to think strategically, Victoria said quietly. If Thomas is bringing that many men, and if he really has federal contacts, we run, Ayanna said immediately. Get in your truck and drive. By the time they figure out we're gone, we'll be states away. Running makes us look guilty, and it gives Thomas exactly the story he wants to tell, that I kidnapped you. And then what do? Victoria pulled out her own cell phone and began scrolling through contacts. We make some calls of our own. Meanwhile, outside, the conversation had grown heated. Frank was pacing angrily while James tried to mediate between the factions. Samuel, think about what you're doing, James pleaded. Thomas Whitehorse has power beyond the reservation, political connections, business relationships, friends in government. If you humiliate him like this, what? He'll make life difficult for our people. He's already doing that. His development projects are poisoning our water sources. His political maneuvering is selling our sovereignty piece by piece to the highest bidder. Then why did you agree to the marriage in the first place? Robert demanded. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Because I was afraid of Thomas's power, afraid of federal retaliation, afraid of losing what little independence we have left. I thought sacrificing one girl's happiness was an acceptable price for community peace. And now I realize I was sacrificing the very thing I was trying to protect. What's the point of preserving our community if we destroy our children's souls in the process? Frank snorted in disgust. Pretty words, Samuel, but when Thomas gets here with 15 men and federal agents, your pretty words won't protect anyone. Inside the cabin, Victoria had connected with her supervisor at the Forest Service, explaining the situation in careful, professional terms. She emphasized the environmental violations she'd documented, the potential for violence, and the need for immediate federal oversight. Dr. Chen, I need you to contact the regional FBI office, Victoria said. Not the agents Thomas Whitehorse has connections with, but the Environmental Crimes Unit. I have 3 years of documentation showing illegal dumping, water contamination, and permit violations on federal land adjacent to the reservation. Victoria, are you sure about this? Going after someone with political connections could end your career. My career is already over if I don't stop this. Thomas Whitehorse is planning to claim I kidnapped a 15-year-old girl to prevent her from fulfilling a marriage contract. I need federal protection, and I need it tonight. While Victoria made her calls, Ayanna had moved to Samuel's abandoned coffee cup and was staring into the dark liquid as if searching for answers. Grandmother used to read signs in coffee grounds, she said softly. She said the spirit spoke through everyday things if you knew how to listen. "What do you see?" Victoria asked, finishing her call. "Chaos, change, and—" Ayana paused, tilting the cup. "Maybe hope, but it's hard to tell." Outside, headlights appeared through the trees. Not the single-file convoy of Samuel's group, but a scattered pattern suggesting multiple vehicles arriving from different directions. "That's not Thomas," James said nervously. "He's not due for another hour." Samuel shaded his eyes against the glare. "Federal vehicles. 3 of them." Frank paled. "Did someone call the FBI?" "Not Thomas's friends," Samuel said grimly. "These are marked environmental protection units." Victoria smiled as she watched through the window. Dr. Chen had moved faster than she'd hoped. The 3 federal SUVs formed a semicircle around the clearing, and 6 agents in tactical gear emerged, along with 2 people in civilian clothes carrying briefcases. Special Agent Maria Santos approached Samuel's group. She was a small, professional-looking woman in her 40s, but she carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Mr. Crow Feather?" "I'm Agent Santos, EPA Criminal Investigation Division. We need to speak with you and Ms. Victoria Martinez about some serious environmental violations in this area." "Environmental violations?" Frank stammered. "We're here about a family matter." Agent Santos studied Frank with cool eyes. "Are you Frank Redbird? We have some questions for you too. About your construction company's dumping practices near the Clearwater River." Frank's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about. We have satellite imagery, water samples, and witness testimony suggesting otherwise. But that's not why we're here tonight." She turned back to Samuel. "We understand there may be threats of violence against a federal witness." Samuel's eyebrows rose. "Federal witness?" "Ms. Martinez has been providing environmental impact documentation for several ongoing investigations. If there are credible threats against her safety, that's a federal crime." Victoria opened the cabin door and stepped outside, with Ayana close behind her. Agent Santos nodded professionally. "Ms. Martinez, are you and your companion safe?" "For now," Victoria said, "but we're expecting company soon. Thomas Whitehorse is bringing a substantial group of men, and he's made threats about federal kidnapping charges." "Mr. Whitehorse called our office 3 hours ago," Agent Santos said. "Very interesting conversation. He seemed to know quite a bit about federal law enforcement procedures for someone who claims to be a simple businessman." "What do you mean?" "He knew exactly which agents to call, exactly which laws to cite, and exactly how to file complaints that would normally bypass standard review processes. That kind of knowledge usually comes from extensive professional relationships." Samuel stepped closer. "You think Thomas has been working with federal agents?" "We think Mr. Whitehorse has been very helpful to certain law enforcement officials over the years. Particularly helpful in cases involving land use disputes, mineral rights, and water access issues. Coincidentally, all cases where Mr. Whitehorse's business interests benefited from the outcomes. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Thomas hadn't just been using federal connections to intimidate tribal members. He'd been actively collaborating with corrupt agents to manipulate legal decisions affecting the reservation. That's why he was so confident about the marriage," Ayana said suddenly. "It wasn't just about allying with our families. It was about silencing grandfather's voice on the tribal council. With me as his wife, he'd have direct influence over reservation decisions." Agent Santos nodded approvingly. "Smart girl. That's exactly what our analysis suggests. Mr. Whitehorse has been systematically building control over tribal politics through marriages, business relationships, and strategic intimidation." "And you're here to stop him?" Samuel asked. "We're here to serve warrants," Agent Santos said, gesturing to her colleagues who were setting up equipment. "For Thomas Whitehorse, 3 of his business associates and 2 FBI agents who've been taking bribes to influence federal decisions affecting tribal land." Frank Redbird, had been growing paler throughout this conversation. Now he turned to bolt toward the tree line, but found his way blocked by two federal agents. "Mr. Redbird, we'd like you to stay and answer some questions about your company's relationship with Whitehorse Development Corporation." As if summoned by the mention of his name, more headlights appeared through the trees. This time it was the convoy everyone had been expecting, Thomas Whitehorse arriving with his small army. But instead of the triumphant confrontation he'd probably envisioned, Thomas Whitehorse drove into a federal crime scene with agents, equipment, and enough evidence to end his reign of intimidation permanently. Agent Santos smiled as she watched the approaching vehicles. "Perfect timing. Mr. Whitehorse just saved us the trouble of tracking him down at his compound." Victoria felt Ayana's hand slip into hers as they watched Thomas's convoy slow and then stop as the drivers realized what they were driving into. "Is it over?" Ayana asked quietly. "The legal part is just beginning," Victoria said, "but the part where you're forced into marriage, that's definitely over." Samuel moved to stand beside his granddaughter. "Ayana, I owe you an apology. I let fear make me weak, and I almost sacrificed your future for the illusion of safety. You changed your mind when it mattered, grandfather. That's what counts." "Eleanor would be proud of you both," Samuel said, looking between his granddaughter and Victoria. "And I think she'd be particularly pleased that her granddaughter's rescuer turned out to be someone worth knowing." Victoria smiled, watching federal agents approach Thomas Whitehorse's vehicles with warrants and handcuffs at the ready. "I think your grandmother would say the spirits work in mysterious ways." "She always did things in mysterious ways," Ayana agreed, squeezing Victoria's hand. "She said the best stories always had unexpected endings." Thomas Whitehorse emerged from his black SUV like a man accustomed to commanding respect through sheer presence. At 55, he was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and expensive clothing that marked him as someone who moved easily between the reservation and the broader world. His entourage fanned out behind him, 15 men as promised, including his 3 sons and several tribal council members who owed him favors. But his confident stride faltered when he saw the federal agents, the crime scene equipment, and Agent Santos approaching him with a folder of documents in her hand. "Thomas Whitehorse," Agent Santos called out, her voice carrying clearly through the cold mountain air. Thomas stopped 20 feet from the cabin, his eyes scanning the scene. Victoria could see him calculating, trying to understand how his carefully orchestrated power play had transformed into what looked suspiciously like a federal investigation. "I'm Thomas Whitehorse," he said carefully. "I'm here on tribal business to retrieve my fiancée." "Your fiancée?" Agent Santos consulted her paperwork. "According to our information, you're referring to Ayana Crowfeather, a 15-year-old minor who has explicitly refused marriage to you. Arranged marriages are a legitimate tribal custom protected by federal law. Forced marriages of minors are not protected by any law, federal or tribal. But that's not why we're here tonight." Agent Santos handed Thomas a folded document. "Thomas Whitehorse, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery of federal officials, environmental crimes, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." The clearing erupted in confusion. Thomas's men started toward the agents, but found themselves facing tactical officers who had quietly moved into position during the conversation. Thomas himself stood frozen, the arrest warrant in his hands, as Agent Santos continued reading. "His rights. This is a mistake," Thomas said when she finished. "I'm a respected businessman, a tribal leader. You're a criminal who's been using federal agents to manipulate land use decisions for your personal profit," Agent Santos interrupted. "We have recorded conversations, financial records, and testimony from 3 of your business partners who've already agreed to cooperate." One of Thomas's sons, a man in his 20s with his father's build but none of his composure, stepped forward aggressively. You can't just come onto tribal land and arrest our father based on lies from some white bitch. The tactical officer nearest to him moved faster than Victoria would have thought possible. Within seconds, Thomas's son was face down in the snow with his hands cuffed behind his back. "Marcus Whitehorse, you're under arrest for threatening a federal witness," the officer announced calmly. Thomas watched his son being hauled to his feet, and Victoria saw something crumble in his expression. This wasn't going according to any plan he could have imagined. "The corruption charges are serious enough," Agent Santos continued, addressing Thomas directly. "But the environmental crimes are what really interest us. Illegal dumping of construction waste into protected watersheds, falsifying environmental impact reports, bribing inspectors to overlook violations. We have evidence of systematic poisoning of tribal water sources." Samuel stepped forward, his weathered face hard with anger. "You've been poisoning our water?" "The water samples don't lie," Agent Santos said. "Heavy metals, industrial chemicals, construction debris, all traced back to Whitehorse development projects. The same water sources are used for traditional ceremonies, fishing and drinking water for 3 tribal communities." "How long?" Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. "Based on our analysis, at least 5 years, possibly longer." The other tribal council members in Thomas's entourage began backing away from him, the implications hitting them like physical blows. Water was sacred to the Apache people. Poisoning it was not just a crime, but a spiritual violation of the deepest kind. "You lying federal witch!" Thomas snarled at Agent Santos. "This is all fabricated to destroy me because I won't bow down to your environmental extremist agenda." "Mr. Whitehorse, we have satellite footage of your crews dumping waste directly into the Clearwater River. We have water samples showing contamination patterns that match your construction schedules. We have financial records showing payments to federal agents in exchange for delayed inspections and falsified reports." "Agent," Santos gestured to her colleagues who were setting up a laptop and projector, "would you like to see the evidence? We can start with the footage from last month, where your crew dumped 17 tons of construction debris into a protected wetland." The laptop screen flickered to life, displaying aerial footage that was damning in its clarity. Victoria watched, Thomas's face go ashen as the video played, showing trucks bearing his company's logo systematically dumping waste into pristine wilderness areas. "The environmental damage alone carries federal penalties up to 30 years in prison," Agent Santos continued. "The corruption charges add another 20. The racketeering charges," she shrugged. "Let's just say you'll have plenty of time to think about your choices." Ayana had been silent throughout the arrests, but now she stepped forward. "What about the other marriages you arranged? The other girls whose families owed you money or favors?" Agent Santos looked surprised. "Other marriages? My cousin Rebecca. She was 16 when she married Thomas's business partner. And Maria Santos, she was 15 when she married the man who runs Thomas's trucking company. Both marriages were arranged to secure business deals." "Are you saying there's a pattern of forced marriages involving minors in exchange for business relationships?" Samuel closed his eyes in pain. "I didn't know. Thomas told me these were traditional arrangements, that the families were honored by the connections." "They weren't honored," Ayana said firmly. "They were desperate. Rebecca's family owed Thomas money for medical bills. Maria's father needed work after his construction crew was blacklisted for refusing to dump waste illegally." Agent Santos was taking notes rapidly. "We'll need to interview these young women and any others who might be involved in similar arrangements." "There are at least 6 more," Ayana said. "Maybe 8. All underage at the time of marriage, all from families who owed Thomas money or needed his help with federal agencies." Victoria felt sick. The scope of Thomas's manipulation was staggering. He'd been using his federal connections not just to bypass environmental regulations, but to create a system of debt and dependency that forced families to sacrifice their daughters. "This isn't just corruption," Victoria said. "It's human trafficking." Agent Santos nodded grimly. "Federal human trafficking charges carry life sentences in cases involving minors." Thomas finally seemed to realize the full extent of his situation. His composure completely shattered, and he began shouting desperately, "You can't prove any of this. Those marriages were consensual, traditional arrangements. You're destroying our culture to satisfy your white feminist agenda." "Mr. Whitehorse," Agent Santos said wearily, "we have financial records showing you paid federal agents to expedite marriage licenses for underage girls. We have recorded conversations where you discuss using marriage arrangements to secure business deals. We have testimony from families saying you threatened them with federal investigations if they didn't agree to the marriages." "They're lying. They're all lying." "Sir, you're making this worse for yourself." But Thomas was beyond reason now, his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him. "This is all her fault," he screamed, pointing at Ayana, "that ungrateful girl and her poisonous grandfather. I offered them honor, security, a place in my organization, and they spat in my face." "You offered them slavery," Samuel said quietly, "and called it honor." Agent Santos gestured to her officers, who began moving Thomas toward one of the federal vehicles. As they did, more agents emerged from the forest. They'd been conducting simultaneous raids on Thomas's compound, his business offices, and the homes of his co-conspirators. "We've secured the financial records," one agent reported via radio, "and we found the safe room with the backup files. Everything Agent Martinez documented is confirmed, plus about 15 additional violations." Victoria blinked in surprise. "Agent Martinez?" Agent Santos smiled. "Ms. Martinez, your environmental documentation has been the foundation of our investigation. For 8 months, your reports on water contamination, illegal dumping, and permit violations gave us the probable cause we needed for federal warrants." "I didn't know I was part of a federal investigation." "You weren't, officially. But when environmental crimes occur on federal land, adjacent to tribal territory, and when those crimes involve corruption of federal agents, the EPA takes a very serious interest." As Thomas was loaded into the federal vehicle, still shouting about conspiracies and cultural destruction, his remaining supporters began melting away into the forest. Without their leader's federal protection, they wanted no part of his downfall. Frank Redbird, however, wasn't escaping so easily. Agent Santos approached him with another set of documents. "Mr. Redbird, you're also under arrest. Your construction company has been the primary vehicle for illegal dumping operations. We have evidence of your direct involvement in environmental crimes spanning 5 years. Frank looked desperately at Samuel. "Samuel, you have to help me. We've been friends for decades. I was just following orders, trying to keep my business alive. By poisoning our water," Samuel's voice was cold, "by helping Thomas destroy the land our children will inherit." "I didn't have a choice. Thomas controlled all the federal contracts. If I didn't cooperate, my company would have gone bankrupt. There's always a choice, Frank. You chose money over our people's future." As Frank was led away in handcuffs, Agent Santos turned to the remaining group. "This investigation is far from over. We'll need extensive testimony from tribal members, environmental assessments of all affected areas, and cooperation in identifying additional victims of the marriage trafficking scheme. Whatever you need," Samuel said firmly. "Our people deserve justice, and our land deserves protection." Agent Santos nodded approvingly. "We'll also need Ms. Martinez to continue her environmental monitoring work. The EPA is establishing a permanent oversight office for this region, and we'd like her to head it." Victoria's eyes widened. "A permanent office? federal funding, expanded authority, and a mandate to prevent future environmental crimes on or adjacent to tribal lands. It's a significant promotion, with commensurate salary and benefits. Victoria looked at Ayana, who was grinning despite everything they'd been through. "What do you think? Should I take a job that would keep me in this area permanently?" "I think Grandmother would say the spirits just offered you exactly what you were meant to do with your life." Samuel stepped forward. "Ms. Martinez, Victoria, I owe you more than I can ever repay. You saved my granddaughter's life, opened my eyes to the truth about Thomas, and helped protect our people from a predator we didn't even recognize. You don't owe me anything, Samuel. We protected each other. Nevertheless, I'd like to make you an offer. The tribal council will be restructured now that Thomas's influence is gone. We'll need advisors who understand both environmental science and federal law. People we can trust to put our community's long-term interests first. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a place in our family, a chance to help heal the damage that's been done to our land and our people." Victoria felt tears stinging her eyes. 24 hours ago, she'd been a solitary researcher tracking elk migration patterns. Now, she was being offered not just a career opportunity, but a community to belong to. "What about college?" Victoria asked Ayana. "Your plans for environmental science?" "The new EPA office will need summer interns," Agent Santos interjected, "and we have partnerships with several universities for environmental science programs. A young woman with Ms. Crowfeather's background and motivation would be an ideal candidate for our scholarship programs." Ayana looked stunned. "Scholarships? Full ride to any accredited environmental science program, plus guaranteed internships and job placement after graduation. The federal government has a vested interest in training the next generation of environmental protection specialists." Samuel smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Victoria had seen from him. Eleanor would be so proud, her granddaughter, following in the footsteps of warrior women, but fighting modern battles with modern weapons. "Education as a weapon," Ayana mused. "I like that." As the federal agents finished processing the crime scene and loading the last of Thomas's conspirators into vehicles, dawn began breaking over the mountain peaks. The sky lightened from black to deep purple to rose gold, painting the snow-covered forest in ethereal beauty. Victoria realized they'd been awake all night, but she felt energized rather than exhausted. Everything had changed in the space of a few hours, for her, for Ayana, for the entire community. "So what happens now?" Ayana asked, watching the federal convoy disappear down the mountain road. "Now you go to college," Victoria said. "You study environmental science and federal law and anything else that interests you. You become the warrior your grandmother knew you could be. And you? I stay here. I help rebuild what Thomas destroyed. I work with your grandfather and the tribal council to make sure something like this never happens again." Samuel nodded approvingly. "And in 4 years, when Ayana graduates, she'll come home to a community that's stronger and cleaner and safer than the one she left. Will you really wait for me?" Ayana asked Victoria. 4 years is a long time." Victoria smiled, looking out at the forest that would become her permanent home, at the work that would become her life's mission, at the people who had become her chosen family. "I'll be here," she said simply, "building something worth coming home to." As the sun fully rose over the Colorado wilderness, painting the world in gold and possibility, 3 people stood together outside a small cabin where a desperate rescue had become the foundation for healing an entire community. The river that had nearly claimed Ayana's life now sparkled in the morning light, its waters flowing clean toward a future none of them could have imagined just 24 hours before. 6 months after that frozen February night, Victoria stood In the same clearing where federal agents had arrested Thomas Whitehorse, but the scene before her couldn't have been more different. Where once there had been tension and fear, now there was celebration. The Apache community had gathered for the first annual water blessing ceremony since the contamination had been cleaned up, and the sound of traditional drums echoed through the pine trees. Ayana emerged from the ceremonial lodge wearing traditional Apache dress. Not the heavy, waterlogged garments she'd nearly drowned in, but beautiful new regalia that her great-aunt had spent months creating. The intricate beadwork told the story of water as the source of all life, and silver ornaments caught the late summer sunlight as she moved. "You look radiant," Victoria said, adjusting the eagle feather in Ayana's hair. "Ready for your blessing?" "Ready. To leave for college tomorrow," Ayana replied, but her voice carried excitement rather than fear now. "Though I still can't believe Stanford accepted me with a full scholarship. Your essay about using traditional ecological knowledge to inform modern environmental science was brilliant. Plus, your summer internship work, documenting the river restoration project, impressed the EPA selection committee." Samuel approached, carrying a medicine bundle wrapped in soft deer hide. At 71, he looked years younger than he had that terrible night when Thomas had controlled so much of their lives. The stress lines around his eyes had softened, and he moved with the confident stride of a leader whose community trusted him completely. "Granddaughter," he said formally, "it's time." The ceremony that followed was both ancient and remarkably contemporary. Traditional prayers were offered in Apache, but they included specific gratitude for the scientists and federal agents who had helped restore the poisoned waterways. Sacred tobacco was burned alongside laboratory reports documenting the successful cleanup. Young and old stood together, honoring both traditional wisdom and modern knowledge. Victoria watched from the edge of the ceremony, moved by how seamlessly the community had integrated old and new ways of understanding their relationship with the natural world. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the EPA hydrogeologist who had overseen the water restoration, stood beside her. "In 30 years of environmental restoration work, I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Vasquez murmured. "Most communities struggle to trust federal agencies after contamination incidents. But Samuel Crow Feather has created something remarkable. Here, he learned that trust has to be earned through action, not just words," Victoria replied. "When we proved we were willing to fight for their water, they were willing to work with us to heal it." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, environmental cleanup, and community healing. Thomas Whitehorse had been sentenced to 45 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to racketeering, environmental crimes, and human trafficking. His business empire had been dismantled, with assets liquidated to fund restoration efforts and victim compensation. More importantly, the 8 young women who had been forced into marriages through Thomas's schemes were now free. 3 had chosen to dissolve their marriages and pursue education. 2 had decided to remain married but renegotiated their relationships as partnerships between equals. 3 others were still working through their decisions with counselors and legal advocates. "The healing isn't just environmental," Victoria observed, watching as Rebecca Whitehorse, formerly one of Thomas's trafficking victims, laughed with her children while her husband tended the ceremonial fire. "It's social, cultural, spiritual," Dr. Vasquez nodded. "The water was just the most visible wound. The deeper injuries were to trust, to community bonds, to people's sense of agency over their own lives." As the formal ceremony concluded, the gathering transformed into a community feast. Long tables groaned under the weight of traditional foods alongside modern conveniences. Fry bread and green chili stew next to coolers full of ice-cold sodas, traditional corn soup served in both pottery bowls and paper cups. Victoria found herself seated between Samuel and Maria Santos, the young woman who had been forced into marriage at 15 and was now, at 19, preparing to start her freshman year at the University of New Mexico. "I keep expecting to wake up and find out this is all a dream," Maria confessed, picking at her plate nervously. "4 years ago, I thought my life was over. Now I'm going to study social work so I can help other girls in situations like mine." "It's not a dream," Samuel assured her. "It's what happens when brave people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable." "Speaking of brave people," Maria said, turning to Victoria, "I heard you turned down a promotion to the EPA headquarters in Washington." Victoria shrugged. "This is where the work needs to be done. Besides, someone has to keep an eye on the long-term restoration projects." What she didn't mention was how completely this place had become home to her. The cabin that had once been a simple retreat was now the center of a life she could never have imagined. She worked closely with the Tribal Environmental Committee, trained local young people in water quality monitoring, and had begun a relationship with Dr. James Whitefeather, Samuel's nephew and the reservation's new doctor. "Victoria's being modest," Dr. Vasquez interjected. "The EPA restoration model she's developed here is being studied for implementation across the western United States. She's revolutionizing how federal agencies work with tribal communities." Ayana leaned across the table. "She's also been teaching traditional plant identification to EPA botanists. Grandmother would be amazed to see federal scientists learning Apache names for medicinal plants." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Agent Santos, who had driven up from Albuquerque for the ceremony. She looked relaxed in civilian clothes, a marked contrast to the tense federal agent who had arrested Thomas 6 months earlier. "How's the prosecution proceeding?" Samuel asked. "Thomas's appeals were denied last week. His sentence is final. More importantly, the corruption investigation has led to arrests of federal agents in 3 other states. The network was bigger than we initially realized, and the tribal sovereignty issues. Congress is actually moving forward with legislation to strengthen tribal authority over environmental crimes affecting reservation lands. Your case became the poster child for why current federal oversight was inadequate." Victoria felt a surge of satisfaction. The legal and political changes emerging from their crisis would protect other communities from similar exploitation. As evening approached, the celebration began winding down. Families loaded leftover food into coolers while children ran between the tables, playing tag in the growing dusk. Victoria helped stack chairs and fold tables, marveling at how natural it felt to be part of this community's rhythms. Ayana found her as she was carrying the last folding chair to the storage shed. "Walk with me," Ayana requested. "I want to see the river one more time before I leave tomorrow." They made their way through the forest to the spot where Ayana had fallen through the ice 8 months earlier. The scene was dramatically different. Now, late summer instead of bitter winter, flowing water instead of treacherous ice, hope instead of desperation. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been tracking that elk herd that day?" Ayana asked, settling on a boulder beside the restored stream. "Every day. But your grandmother would probably say that dwelling on what-ifs distracts from appreciating what is." Ayana smiled. "She would say exactly that. She'd also say that the spirits put you in the right place at the right time because they knew we needed each other." Victoria studied the girl who had become like a daughter to her. At 16, Ayana had grown taller and more confident, but she still carried that fierce intelligence that had impressed Victoria from their first conversation. "Are you nervous about Stanford?" "Terrified," Ayana admitted, "but excited too. I keep thinking about all the things I'll learn, all the ways I can help our people when I come back." "And you will come back?" "This is home. These are my people. My fight is here." Ayana picked up a smooth riverstone and turned it over in her palm. "But I need to gather weapons first. Knowledge, connections, credentials that will make people listen when I speak. Victoria nodded approvingly. Your grandmother's warrior spirit applied to modern battles. Exactly. I want to study traditional ecological knowledge alongside Western science. I want to learn environmental law and policy analysis. I want to become someone who can protect places like this from the next Thomas Whitehorse. There will always be another Thomas Whitehorse, Victoria said gently. Someone who mistakes power for wisdom, who treats people as resources to be exploited. Then there will always be work for people like us. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the healthy sound of clean water flowing over restored stones. Victoria reflected on how much her own life had changed. The solitary researcher who had tracked elk alone through winter forests had become part of something larger, a community committed to healing both environmental and social wounds. Victoria, Ayana said suddenly, I need to ask you something important. Of course, when I graduate, when I come back with my degree and all that knowledge, will you be my partner? Not just in the work, but really, will you help me build something that honors both traditional wisdom and modern science? Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. Ayana, I can't think of anything I'd rather do with my life. Good, because I've been thinking about what grandmother would say about all this. About you saving me from the river, about Samuel changing his mind, about Thomas being stopped, about all of us finding our way to each other. What would she say? She'd say that some stories are bigger than the people living them, that sometimes individuals become part of something that was always meant to happen, even if they don't understand it at the time. Victoria considered this, a story that was always going to be told, just waiting for the right people to live it. Exactly. You didn't just save me from drowning, Victoria. You saved our whole community from a poison that was destroying us from the inside. But maybe you were always going to be the person who did that. Maybe everything that happened was just inevitable. I don't know if I believe in inevitability, Victoria said carefully. Then believe in this. Tomorrow I leave for college to become the environmental scientist and legal advocate our people need. You stay here to keep building the partnership between our community and federal agencies. Samuel continues healing the divisions Thomas created. In 4 years, I come home with the tools we need to protect our sacred places forever. Victoria smiled. That sounds like a pretty good story. It sounds like the beginning of one. The real story starts when I come back and we begin the work of making sure no other communities go through what ours did. As they walked back toward the clearing, Victoria realized that Ayana was right. The rescue at the frozen river had been dramatic, but it was just the opening chapter of something much larger. The real story would be written over the coming years as this community became a model for how traditional knowledge and modern science could work together to protect both cultural heritage and environmental health. The next morning, Victoria stood with Samuel and half the reservation to see Ayana off to Stanford. The young woman who had nearly drowned rather than accept an unwanted marriage was now heading toward a future she had chosen for herself. 4 years, Ayana said, hugging Victoria tightly. And then we change the world. We've already started, Victoria replied. Now we just have to finish the job. As Ayana's bus disappeared down the mountain road, Victoria felt Samuel's hand on her shoulder. Eleanor would have loved this moment, he said quietly. Her granddaughter is leaving to gain the knowledge she needs to serve her people, going with the blessing of a community that believes in her dreams. Eleanor is part of this, Victoria said. Her wisdom, her stories, her belief in strong women who fight for justice, it's all part of what brought us here. Samuel nodded. The best way to honor the ancestors is to become ancestors worth honoring ourselves. Victoria looked out over the restored landscape, thinking about the work ahead. environmental monitoring, community partnerships, policy development, training the next generation of indigenous environmental scientists. It was exactly the life she had never known she wanted. Some stories, she reflected, really were bigger than the people living them, but maybe that just meant the people living them had the chance to become bigger than they ever imagined possible. 2 years after Ayana left for Stanford, Victoria received a phone call that would test everything they had built together. She was in her EPA field office reviewing water quality reports when her secure line rang with an urgent tone she recognized. "Victoria, it's Agent Santos. We have a problem." Victoria set down her coffee and focused. Maria Santos had become more than a federal contact over the past 2 years. She was a friend and trusted ally in ongoing efforts to prevent environmental crimes across the Southwest. What kind of problem? Thomas Whitehorse's nephew, David Whitehorse, has been released from federal prison. He served 18 months for money laundering related to his uncle's operation, and he's been making inquiries about you, about Ayana, about the tribal council. Victoria felt ice form in her stomach. What kind of inquiries? Private investigator reports, property records, university enrollment information. He's been tracking everyone involved in his uncle's downfall. And Victoria, he's not alone. 3 other men connected to Thomas's organization were released in the past 6 months. They've been meeting regularly. Victoria walked to her office window, looking out at the forest that had become her sanctuary. Are you saying they're planning something? I'm saying they're angry, organized, and have nothing left to lose. Thomas died in federal prison 3 weeks ago, heart attack. These men blame his death on the people who destroyed his empire. The news hit Victoria harder than she expected. Despite everything Thomas had done, his death felt like an ending to one chapter and the ominous beginning of another. Has Samuel been informed? That's why I'm calling you first. The tribal police don't have the resources to provide adequate protection, and federal marshals can't maintain a presence on the reservation without specific threats being made. So we wait until someone gets hurt before we can do anything? Unless we can find evidence of an actual conspiracy, which is where you come in. Victoria understood immediately. You want me to be bait. I want you to be careful and observant. If David Whitehorse is planning revenge, you and Ayana are likely primary targets. But if we can document conspiracy to commit crimes on federal land, we can arrest them before they act. Victoria was already thinking through the implications. What does Samuel know? Nothing yet. I wanted to coordinate with you first. Victoria made a quick decision. I'll drive to the reservation this afternoon. Samuel needs to hear this from someone he trusts, and the tribal council needs to understand the scope of the potential threat. Victoria, there's something else. David Whitehorse isn't like his uncle. Thomas was calculating, methodical. David is volatile. Prison didn't rehabilitate him. It made him angrier. After ending the call, Victoria sat staring at her computer screen, unable to focus on water quality data. The peaceful progress of the past 2 years suddenly felt fragile, threatened by ghosts from a past they'd all hoped was buried. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Ayana. "Call me when you get a chance. Need advice about something." Victoria dialed immediately, grateful for the distraction. "Victoria, perfect timing. I'm walking between classes and have exactly 12 minutes to talk. How's junior year treating you?" "Brutal, but amazing. I'm taking advanced courses in environmental law, indigenous rights, and ecological restoration. Plus, I'm working on a research project with one of my professors about traditional ecological knowledge integration in federal land management." Victoria smiled despite her worry. Ayana's enthusiasm was infectious, even through a phone connection across several states. "That sounds incredibly relevant to our work here. That's actually what I wanted to talk about." "Professor Martinez, She's Chicana, grew up on the border dealing with water rights issues. She thinks my research could form the basis for a policy proposal to the EPA, something that would formally recognize traditional ecological knowledge. In federal environmental assessments, Ayana, that could be revolutionary, right? But here's the thing, she wants me to present it at a national conference next month in Denver, which means I'd be relatively close to home for the first time since I left. Victoria's protective instincts immediately fired. David Whitehorse making inquiries, a national conference that would put Ayana in a public forum, the timing feeling too coincidental. That's wonderful news, Victoria said carefully. Tell me about the conference. It's the National Association of Environmental Professionals. 3 days of presentations, networking, policy discussions. Professor Martinez thinks it could lead to internship opportunities with environmental law firms, maybe even early recruitment by federal agencies. Who else knows about this presentation? Ayana paused. What do you mean? Victoria realized she needed to be direct. Ayana, I just learned that Thomas Whitehorse died in prison, and his nephew David has been released. Agent Santos has evidence that David and other former associates have been tracking information about everyone involved in Thomas's arrest. The silence stretched long enough that Victoria wondered if they'd been disconnected. Ayana, I'm here, I'm just processing. Her voice had lost all its earlier enthusiasm. Do you think I'm in danger? I think we need to be careful. The conference itself is probably safe. Too public. Too many witnesses. But travel, hotels, being away from Stanford's security, I can't live in fear forever, Victoria, and this research is too important. If traditional ecological knowledge gets formal recognition in federal policy, it changes everything for indigenous communities nationwide. Victoria admired Ayana's courage, but her worry was growing stronger. What if we arranged additional security, federal protection during travel and at the conference? That seems like overkill for a college student presenting academic research. You're not just any college student. You're the granddaughter of a tribal leader who helped expose a major federal corruption scandal. You're a symbol of resistance to people like David Whitehorse. Another long pause. Victoria, are you trying to scare me into not going? I'm trying to keep you alive. The blunt honesty seemed to shift something in their conversation. When Ayana spoke again, her voice was more mature, more thoughtful. What would grandmother do in this situation? Victoria considered the question seriously. Eleanor Crowfeather, from everything she'd learned about the woman, had been both wise and fierce. She'd assess the real risks versus the imagined ones. She'd consider not just her own safety, but the broader implications of her choices. And she'd refuse to let fear dictate her decisions, but she'd also be smart about protecting herself. Absolutely. Okay, here's what I propose. I present at the conference as planned, because this research is too important to delay. But I coordinate with Agent Santos about security measures, and maybe you come with me. Victoria's heart jumped. She hadn't seen Ayana in person since the girl left for college, though they'd maintained regular contact through calls and video chats. I'm not sure the EPA would approve travel expenses for conference attendance that isn't directly related to my current projects. What if it was related? What if my presentation included a case study about the water restoration work you've been doing? Our partnership between traditional knowledge and federal science could be a model for other regions. Victoria found herself smiling. You've been thinking about this for a while, haven't you? Since sophomore year. Victoria, what we've built together, it's not just about our community anymore. It could transform how federal agencies work with indigenous peoples nationwide. But it needs to be documented, studied, replicated, and presented at national conferences by brilliant young Apache women who aren't afraid to challenge the status quo. Exactly. Victoria made her decision. I'll talk to Agent Santos about security coordination. I'll request EPA approval for conference attendance. And I'll drive up to Denver to hear your presentation and make sure you're safe. Really? Really? But Ayanna, we do this smart. Professional security assessment, coordination with local law enforcement, not taking unnecessary risks. Agreed. And Victoria, thank you for everything, but especially for not trying to protect me by keeping me from doing important work. After ending the call, Victoria immediately contacted Agent Santos to discuss security protocols. Then she called Samuel to update him on both the David Whitehorse situation and Ayanna's upcoming conference presentation. She's becoming exactly what Eleanor dreamed she could be, Samuel said with pride in his voice, a warrior for our people in the modern world. I'm worried that making her too visible could put her in danger. Hiding our brightest lights doesn't protect them. It just ensures their light never reaches the people who need it most. Victoria recognized the wisdom in Samuel's words, but her protective instincts remained strong. Over the following weeks, she worked with Agent Santos to develop comprehensive security protocols, while simultaneously preparing her own presentation about traditional ecological knowledge integration in federal restoration projects. The irony wasn't lost on her that David Whitehorse's threats were actually accelerating the very work that Thomas had tried to prevent. Ayanna's research and Victoria's practical applications were being elevated to national attention, partly because they needed federal protection to present it safely. 3 weeks before the conference, Victoria received another call from Agent Santos. We have a development. David Whitehorse and 2 associates were arrested in Flagstaff for questioning 3 Apache teenagers about Ayanna's whereabouts and travel plans. Victoria's blood chilled. They're actively hunting her. It appears so. The teenagers were smart. They gave false information and immediately reported the contact to tribal police. But this confirms that David Whitehorse is specifically targeting Ayanna. What does this mean for the conference? It means we treat this as a credible threat requiring federal protection. Ayanna will have discreet security throughout her travel and presentation. You will too, as a potential secondary target. Victoria felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The girl she'd pulled from freezing water 2.5 years ago was now a young woman whose work could influence federal policy nationwide. But that same prominence made her a target for people who wanted to silence indigenous voices permanently. Agent Santos, I need to ask you something directly. In your professional judgment, should Ayanna present this research now or wait until we've dealt with David Whitehorse definitively? In my professional judgment, David Whitehorse and men like him will always exist. If we let threats from criminals dictate when and how indigenous scholars share their knowledge, we've already lost. And in your personal judgment? Ayanna Crowfeather is going to change the world. The sooner she starts, the better. Victoria hung up feeling both pride and terror in equal measure. The conference was 3 weeks away, and they would be walking into a situation where academic triumph and physical danger occupied the same space. She spent the evening reviewing Ayanna's research proposal, marveling at how the girl had synthesized traditional Apache ecological knowledge with cutting-edge environmental science. The implications were staggering. If implemented, Ayanna's recommendations could revolutionize how federal agencies approached environmental restoration in indigenous territories across North America. But first, they had to survive long enough to present it. Victoria walked outside her cabin and looked up at the star-filled mountain sky. Somewhere out there, David Whitehorse was planning violence against a young woman whose only crime was being brilliant enough to threaten his worldview. And somewhere else, Ayanna was preparing research that could protect indigenous lands for generations to come. The next 3 weeks would determine which vision of the future would prevail. The Denver Convention Center buzzed with the energy of 1,200 environmental professionals from across North America. Victoria stood in the main lobby, scanning faces and exits with the heightened awareness that came from knowing somewhere in this crowd, danger might be waiting. Agent Santos had assured her that security was comprehensive, but David Whitehorse had proven himself unpredictable. Victoria Martinez, a woman approached with a confident stride and warm smile. "I'm Dr. Carmen Delgado from the University of Colorado. I've been following your restoration work with the Apache communities. Absolutely groundbreaking." Victoria shook the offered hand while continuing to monitor the lobby. "Thank you, Dr. Delgado. Are you here for the Indigenous Knowledge Integration sessions? Wouldn't miss them, especially the presentation by your protégée, Ayanna Crowfeather. Her research proposal has been generating quite a buzz in academic circles." Victoria felt a mix of pride and concern. Ayanna's work gaining recognition was wonderful, but increased visibility meant increased risk. "She's presenting tomorrow morning," Victoria said carefully. "I heard there might be federal officials in attendance, EPA, possibly even Department of Interior representatives. If her recommendations gain traction at that level, it could change everything," Victoria finished. Dr. Delgado nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Traditional ecological knowledge has been marginalized for too long. Having a young Apache woman present peer-reviewed research that validates indigenous environmental practices, it's revolutionary." Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Santos. "Ayanna's flight landed safely. Discreet security in place. Proceed with normal conference activities." Relief flooded through Victoria. Ayanna was here, safe, and ready to present research that could influence federal policy for decades to come. "Dr. Martinez, there you are," a familiar voice called across the lobby. Victoria turned to see Professor Elena Martinez, Ayanna's mentor, from Stanford, approaching with Ayanna beside her. Victoria's breath caught. The girl she'd pulled from freezing water had grown into a poised young woman of 19. Ayanna wore professional attire that somehow managed to honor both her Apache heritage and academic achievement, a tailored blazer over a traditional silver necklace, her long black hair braided with small turquoise beads. "Victoria," Ayanna said, and her voice carried new confidence alongside familiar warmth. "It's so good to see you." Their embrace was brief, but heartfelt. Victoria could feel the strength in Ayanna's frame, the self-assurance that came from 2 years of academic success and personal growth. "You look ready to change the world," Victoria said. "I learned from the best." Ayanna's smile was radiant. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" "Terrified," Victoria admitted. "For about 12 different reasons." Professor Martinez laughed. "That's normal. Ayanna's been pacing her hotel room since yesterday, but her research is solid, her presentation is compelling, and she's got support from some very influential people." "Speaking of which," Ayanna said, lowering her voice, "Agent Santos briefed me on the security situation. I want you to know I'm taking it seriously, but I'm not going to let David Whitehorse's threats diminish what we're trying to accomplish here." Victoria nodded approvingly. "Your grandmother would be proud of that attitude. My grandmother would also tell me to be smart about protecting myself while I'm being brave about protecting others." Dr. Delgado, who had been listening with interest, stepped forward. "Excuse me, but did you say Agent Santos? As in federal protection?" Victoria and Ayanna exchanged glances. They'd agreed to be discreet about security concerns, but clearly word was spreading. "There have been some threats related to our environmental work," Victoria said carefully. "Nothing that should interfere with the conference." "Threats serious enough to warrant federal protection?" Dr. Delgado's expression had shifted from curiosity to concern. "What kind of threats?" Professor Martinez intervened smoothly. "The kind that unfortunately come with challenging, powerful interests. Ayana's research threatens some people who profit from environmental degradation. That's exactly why this work is so important, Dr. Delgado said firmly. Indigenous communities have been targets of environmental racism for generations. When someone like Ayana presents solutions based on traditional knowledge, it challenges the entire power structure. Victoria realized Dr. Delgado understood more than she'd initially revealed. You've dealt with similar situations. My own research on border water rights has generated some uncomfortable attention from certain political groups. Academia isn't as ivory tower as people think. Real research that threatens real money often leads to real consequences. Ayana was listening intently. How do you handle it? The threats, I mean. You do the work anyway. You present the research, you change the policies, and you surround yourself with people who believe in what you're doing. Dr. Delgado gestured around the lobby. Everyone here supports environmental justice. That's not nothing. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a tall man in an expensive suit who approached their group with purposeful strides. Dr. Martinez, Ms. Crow-Feather, he said, extending business cards. I'm Robert Chen, Deputy Director of the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. I've been looking forward to your presentations. Victoria accepted the card with surprise. I wasn't aware the EPA was sending senior officials. Your work integrating traditional ecological knowledge with federal restoration projects has caught significant attention in Washington. If Ms. Crow-Feather's research validates what you've accomplished practically, it could influence policy nationwide. Ayana's eyes widened. Nationwide? The administration is looking for innovative approaches to environmental restoration that respect indigenous sovereignty while achieving measurable results. Your case study provides exactly that model. Victoria felt the weight of implications settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just an academic conference anymore. It was a potential policy summit that could reshape federal environmental practices. Mr. Chen, Victoria said carefully, given the level of attention this is receiving, have you coordinated with the security personnel already in place? Robert Chen's expression became more serious. Agent Santos briefed me on the situation. We're taking appropriate precautions. But Ms. Crow-Feather, I want you to understand that backing down now would send a message that threats and intimidation work against indigenous researchers. I have no intention of backing down, Ayana said firmly. My grandmother always said that the most important battles are the ones you're afraid to fight. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. And she taught me that sometimes you have to risk everything to protect what matters most. Professor Martinez checked her watch. We should get Ayana to the rehearsal room. Tomorrow's presentation needs to be perfect. As they moved through the convention center, Victoria noticed the discreet security presence Agent Santos had arranged. Professional-looking attendees who stood just slightly wrong, who scanned crowds instead of reading conference programs, who maintained sightlines to Ayana at all times. The rehearsal room was smaller than the main auditorium where Ayana would present the next morning, but it was set up identically. Ayana took her place at the podium while Victoria and Professor Martinez settled into seats to provide feedback. Traditional ecological knowledge integration in federal environmental restoration, a case study from Apache territory, Ayana began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. For the next hour, Victoria watched Ayana present research that synthesized ancient Apache ecological wisdom with cutting-edge environmental science. The data was compelling, the analysis was rigorous, and the policy recommendations were revolutionary. Traditional Apache water management practices, implemented for over 1,000 years, demonstrate measurably superior outcomes compared to contemporary federal restoration approaches. Ayana explained, clicking through slides showing before and after photographs of watershed restoration. Indigenous communities maintained healthy ecosystems through integrated management that considered seasonal variation, wildlife migration patterns, and long-term sustainability. Federal restoration projects that ignore this traditional knowledge consistently fail to achieve lasting results. Victoria felt goosebumps as she watched Ayana command the room. This wasn't just academic research. It was a blueprint for transforming how federal agencies approached environmental restoration in indigenous territories. The collaboration between traditional ecological knowledge and modern environmental science, as demonstrated in the Colorado Watershed Restoration Project, achieved 300% better outcomes than comparable federal projects using conventional approaches, Ayana continued. Professor Martinez leaned over to Victoria. She's going to change everything if we can keep her safe long enough to present it, Victoria murmured. After the rehearsal, they gathered in the hotel restaurant for dinner. The conversation flowed between academic discussions of environmental policy and personal updates about reservation life. Ayana wanted to know about every detail of the restoration project's progress, while Victoria was fascinated by Ayana's descriptions of Stanford's research facilities. The best part of college, Ayana said over dessert, is realizing that the traditional knowledge grandmother taught me isn't primitive or outdated. It's actually more sophisticated than most modern approaches. How so? Robert Chen asked. He joined them for dinner, genuinely interested in Ayana's perspective. Take water management, for example. Modern engineering focuses on controlling water flow through dams, diversions, and channelization. But Apache water management worked with natural flow patterns, seasonal variations, and ecosystem needs. The result was healthier watersheds that sustained both human communities and wildlife populations for centuries. But surely modern technology offers advantages, Chen pressed. Absolutely. Modern monitoring equipment, chemical analysis, and data modeling provide tools that traditional practitioners never had, but the fundamental principles, working with natural systems instead of against them, considering long-term sustainability over short-term gains, understanding that everything is connected, those principles are timeless. Victoria watched Chen taking notes and realized he was genuinely considering how Ayana's recommendations might be implemented at the federal level. The challenge, Chen said thoughtfully, is political. Federal agencies have established procedures, approved methodologies, and bureaucratic momentum that resists change, which is exactly why research like Ayana's is so important, Professor Martinez interjected. Peer-reviewed data that demonstrates superior outcomes gives agencies the justification they need to try new approaches. And why people like David Whitehorse want to silence that research, Victoria added grimly. The mention of David Whitehorse cast a shadow over the table. Chen looked troubled. Agent Santos updated me on the latest intelligence. David Whitehorse and his associates have been asking questions about conference security, hotel registrations, and presentation schedules. Ayana set down her fork. They're here? In Denver? We don't know for certain, but we're operating under the assumption that they might be. Victoria felt her protective instincts surge. Maybe we should postpone the presentation. Absolutely not, Ayana said immediately. David Whitehorse has already taken too much from my family, from my community. I won't let him take this too. Ayana, if something happens to you, then something happens to me. But this research gets presented. This policy gets changed. Indigenous communities get the environmental protection they deserve. Ayana's voice carried the same fierce determination Victoria remembered from their first night together in the cabin. Chen nodded slowly. Agent Santos has assured me that security tomorrow will be comprehensive. But Ms. Crowfeather, I want you to understand that if you proceed with this presentation, you're not just representing yourself or your community, you're representing the possibility of fundamental change in how federal agencies work with indigenous peoples. I understand the responsibility, Ayana said quietly, and I'm ready for it. Victoria looked at the young woman across the table, brilliant, brave, and determined to fulfill the promise she'd made to her grandmother's memory. Tomorrow, Ayana would step onto a stage that could launch her into national prominence, or make her a target for violence. Either way, Victoria would be there to make sure she was safe enough to change the world. The morning of Ayana's presentation dawned grey and overcast, with snow clouds gathering over the Denver skyline. Victoria stood by her hotel window, watching early conference attendees hurry across the street toward the convention center, their breath visible in the frigid air. Her phone buzzed at 6:30 a.m. Agent Santos. "We have a problem," Santos said without preamble. Hotel security cameras picked up David Whitehorse in the lobby at 2 a.m. He was dressed as maintenance staff, but facial recognition confirmed his identity. Victoria's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Was he armed? Unknown. By the time security responded to the alert, he was gone. "But Victoria, he knows where you're staying. He knows where Ayana is staying, and he had 3 hours of unsupervised access to hotel infrastructure." Infrastructure? Elevators, stairwells, ventilation systems, fire suppression equipment. If he wanted to cause chaos during evacuation procedures, Victoria understood immediately. He could trap people in the building, or worse, we're implementing emergency protocols. Ayana's presentation moves to a secure conference room with limited access. Audience will be restricted to pre-screened attendees only. She won't like that. This presentation was supposed to reach as many people as possible. Better disappointed than dead. Victoria knocked on Ayana's hotel room door at 7 a.m., finding the young woman already dressed and reviewing her presentation notes over room service breakfast. "You look nervous," Ayana observed, setting down her coffee. "David Whitehorse was in the hotel last night." Ayana went very still. "Here, in this building." Victoria explained the security breach and the new restrictions on her presentation. Ayana listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. "So instead of addressing 1,200 environmental professionals, I'm presenting to maybe 50 people in a locked room. 50 people who include EPA deputy directors, university department heads, and policy researchers who can actually implement your recommendations." "It's not the same, Victoria. The whole point was to generate broad awareness, to create momentum for policy change. The point is to stay alive long enough for your research to matter." Ayana stood and walked to the window, staring down at the convention center. "Do you know what my grandmother used to say about fear?" "Tell me," she said. "Fear was like a river in flood. You can't stop it, but you can choose how to cross it. You can let it sweep you away, or you can find the stones that will carry you safely to the other side." Victoria joined her at the window. "What are the stones in this situation?" "The research itself. The relationships we've built, the people who believe in what we're doing." Ayana turned to face Victoria directly. "And the courage to do what's right, even when it's dangerous." "Ayana, I need you to understand something. If David Whitehorse hurts you, he doesn't just hurt you. He hurts every young indigenous woman who might follow in your footsteps. He sends a message that academic achievement and advocacy work make you a target. And if I hide in a secure room, presenting to 50 people instead of 1,200, what message does that send?" Victoria had no good answer to that question. At 9 a.m., they made their way to the convention center under discreet federal protection. The main auditorium, where Ayana was originally scheduled to present, was packed with attendees, disappointed by the venue change, but a surprising number had managed to gain access to the secure conference room. Robert Chen approached as they entered. "We've screened everyone twice. Metal detectors, background checks, federal database searches. This room is as safe as we can make it." Professor Martinez was already at the front, testing audio equipment and adjusting the projection screen. She looked up as they entered, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. "The audience includes some very influential people," she told Ayanna quietly. "Dr. Sarah Winters from the National Science Foundation, Director James Whitecloud. From the Bureau of Indian Affairs, 3 EPA regional administrators. If your presentation goes well, it could change federal policy within months instead of years," Chen finished. Victoria scanned the audience as they took their seats. 53 people, but they represented the top tier of federal environmental and indigenous affairs leadership. In some ways, this restricted audience might be more valuable than the broader conference attendees. At exactly 10 a.m., Ayanna stepped to the podium. Victoria held her breath as the young woman she'd pulled from freezing water prepared to address the people who could transform environmental policy across North America. Traditional ecological knowledge integration in federal environmental restoration. Ayanna began, her voice clear and confident. What happens when ancient wisdom meets modern science? For the next 45 minutes, Victoria watched Ayanna present research that was both academically rigorous and deeply personal. She spoke about Apache water management practices that had sustained healthy ecosystems for a millennium. She presented data showing how traditional approaches outperformed conventional federal restoration methods. She outlined specific policy, recommendations that could be implemented immediately. But more than the data, Ayanna told stories about her grandmother's teachings, about traditional practitioners who understood ecological relationships that modern science was only beginning to recognize, about communities whose environmental knowledge had been dismissed and marginalized. "My grandmother used to take me to a sacred spring where Apache women had gathered medicine plants for generations," Ayanna said, clicking to a photograph of a pristine mountain stream. "She taught me which plants indicated healthy water, which animals served as watershed guardians, how seasonal ceremonies maintained ecological balance." The room was absolutely silent. Every person focused completely on Ayanna's words. When federal restoration projects ignore this traditional knowledge, they fail. When they incorporate indigenous practices, they succeed beyond all expectations. The choice is simple: continue repeating expensive failures or embrace solutions that have worked for centuries. During the question and answer session, Victoria watched federal officials take detailed notes as Ayanna fielded complex policy questions with impressive expertise. "Ms. Crow-Feather," asked Dr. Winters from the National Science Foundation, "what would implementation of your recommendations require in terms of federal regulatory changes?" 3 specific modifications to current EPA guidelines, formal recognition of traditional ecological knowledge in environmental impact assessments, and partnership agreements with tribal environmental authorities, Ayanna replied without hesitation. "And the timeline for implementation? These changes could be piloted within 6 months and fully implemented within 2 years, assuming federal commitment to the process." Victoria felt tears stinging her eyes as she watched Ayanna command the room. The desperate 15-year-old, who had nearly drowned rather than accept an unwanted marriage, had become a poised advocate whose words could reshape federal environmental policy. As the presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause, Robert Chen approached the podium. "Ms. Crow-Feather, on behalf of the EPA, I'd like to invite you to Washington next month to present these recommendations to the Environmental Justice Advisory Council." "I'd be honored," Ayanna replied. And Dr. Martinez, Chen continued, addressing. Victoria, we'd like to discuss expanding your restoration model to additional sites across the Southwest. Victoria felt the room's energy, the sense that something significant had just occurred. Ayana's presentation hadn't just been successful, it had been transformative. But as they gathered their materials and prepared to leave the secure conference room, Victoria's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Agent Santos. David Whitehorse spotted outside Convention Center, armed, Federal Response Team moving to intercept. The celebration would have to wait. Victoria's phone buzzed again as they exited the secure conference room. Agent Santos's voice was tense. Federal teams have David Whitehorse cornered in the Convention Center parking garage. But Victoria, he's not alone. We count at least 4 armed associates, and they have explosive devices. The corridor around them suddenly filled with federal agents ushering conference attendees toward emergency exits. Victoria grabbed Ayana's arm as Professor Martinez was separated from them in the controlled chaos. This way, Agent Santos appeared beside them, guiding them toward a service elevator. We're evacuating you through the loading dock. What about the other attendees? Ayana asked as they descended. Secondary priority. You're the primary target. The loading dock was organized chaos. Federal vehicles, tactical teams, and evacuation protocols being executed with military precision. Victoria could hear helicopter rotors overhead as they were rushed toward an armored SUV. Agent Santos, Robert Chen's voice crackled over radio. David Whitehorse is demanding to speak with Ayana Crow-Feather. He says he'll release the hostages if she comes to the parking garage. Victoria felt ice in her veins. Hostages? 12 conference attendees, including Professor Martinez. Whitehorse has them in the lower level of the parking garage with what appears to be a significant explosive device. Ayana stopped walking toward the SUV. I have to go. Absolutely not, Victoria said immediately. He has Professor Martinez. He has innocent people who are only in danger because of me. Agent Santos stepped between them and the parking garage. Ms. Crow-Feather, federal negotiators are trained for this situation. Your presence would only escalate. My presence is what he wants. It's what might save those people. Victoria saw the familiar determination in Ayana's eyes, the same fierce resolve that had kept her fighting in freezing water 3 years ago. Ayana, think about what your grandmother would say. She'd say that sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to sacrifice yourself for others. Agent Santos was receiving rapid updates through her earpiece. Whitehorse is becoming increasingly agitated. He's given us 10 minutes before he starts killing hostages. Then we don't have time to argue, Ayana said, starting toward the parking garage entrance. Victoria caught her arm. If you're going, I'm going with you. Victoria, no. We do this together or not at all. Agent Santos looked between them, clearly calculating risks. Federal protocol prohibits civilians from entering active hostage situations. Then arrest us afterward, Victoria said. But right now, we might be the only chance those people have. 3 minutes later, Victoria and Ayana walked into the convention center parking garage under the protection of tactical snipers positioned throughout the structure. The lower level was dimly lit, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls. David Whitehorse stood in the center of the garage, a dead man's switch in his hand, connected to what looked like enough explosives to bring down the entire building. 12 people knelt in a semicircle around him, including Professor Martinez, whose eyes widened with fear when she saw Ayana approaching. The famous Ayana Crow-Feather, David called out, his voice carrying the unstable edge of someone with nothing left to lose. The Apache princess who destroyed my family. Your uncle destroyed himself, Ayana replied, her voice steady despite the danger. I just refused to be his victim. My uncle built something important. He gave our people Power, respect, and economic opportunity. And you tore it all down for what? So you could play as a college student? Victoria could see federal snipers moving into position in the shadows, but the hostages were too close to David for a clean shot. Your uncle poisoned water sources, forced children into marriage, and corrupted federal agents, Ayana said. He built his power by destroying the things that should have been protected. And what have you built? Academic papers, research presentations. You think that changes anything? I think it changes everything. David's laugh was bitter. You're still that naive little girl who thought she could escape her responsibilities. Well, today you learn that actions have consequences. You're right, Ayana said, taking a step closer. Actions do have consequences. Your uncle's actions led to federal prison and death. Your actions led to this moment where you're threatening innocent people because you can't accept that the world has moved beyond your family's corruption. Shut up! David's hand tightened on the dead man's switch. And my actions led to policy. Changes that will protect indigenous communities for generations. That will ensure traditional ecological knowledge is respected in federal decision-making. That will prevent other Thomas White horses from poisoning water sources and exploiting vulnerable families. Victoria watched Ayana walk steadily toward David, speaking with calm authority, even as she moved closer to the explosives. This morning, 50 of the most influential environmental policy leaders in North America heard research that will transform how federal agencies work with indigenous peoples. That research is already being implemented. The changes are already happening. None of that matters if you're dead, David snarled. It matters more if I'm dead, Ayana replied, because then I become a symbol instead of just a researcher. My death would generate national attention, federal investigations, and political pressure that would accelerate every policy change I recommended. Victoria realized what Ayana was doing. She was simultaneously defusing David's motivation while positioning herself as the primary target, drawing him away from the hostages. So kill me if you want, Ayana continued, now close enough to David that the snipers had clear shots at him. But understand that killing me accomplishes the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. David's expression shifted from rage to confusion. I just want my family's honor restored. Then restore it. Put down the switch. Release these people. Face the consequences of your choices with dignity instead of adding mass murder to your family's legacy. For a moment, the garage was absolutely silent, except for the distant sound of helicopters and sirens. Then David Whitehorse began to cry. I lost everything, he whispered. My uncle, my inheritance, my future, everything I was supposed to be. Then become something better, Ayana said gently. It's not too late to choose differently. David looked at the dead man's switch in his hand, then at the hostages, then at Ayana standing just feet away from him. I don't know how, he said. Start by letting these people go home to their families. David Whitehorse set the dead man's switch carefully on the concrete floor and raised his hands above his head. 2 years later, Victoria stood in the same Colorado clearing where she had first met Ayana, but now it hosted a different kind of gathering. The EPA's new Indigenous Environmental Knowledge Integration Program was holding its first annual conference, bringing together traditional practitioners and federal scientists from across North America. Ayana, now graduated from Stanford, with highest honors and working as the program's youngest policy director, addressed the assembled crowd. 3 years ago, I nearly drowned in this river because I was so desperate to escape a future I didn't choose, she said, gesturing toward the restored waterway. Today, I stand here having chosen a future where traditional knowledge and modern science work together to heal the damage that ignorance and exploitation have caused. Victoria smiled as she watched Ayana command the attention of federal officials, tribal leaders, and environmental scientists. The girl she'd pulled from freezing water had become exactly what her grandmother had envisioned. A warrior for her people in the modern world. After the ceremony, as attendees shared traditional foods and modern refreshments, Samuel approached Victoria with a familiar expression of pride mixed with amazement. "Eleanor would hardly believe it," he said, watching Ayana explain traditional plant medicines to a group of EPA botanists. Her granddaughter is changing federal policy, protecting sacred sites, and teaching government scientists to listen to indigenous wisdom. "She'd probably say the spirits work in mysterious ways," Victoria replied. "She'd also say that some rescues take longer to complete than others. You didn't just pull Ayana out of that river, Victoria. You pulled our entire community toward a better future." Victoria looked around the gathering, at young indigenous people preparing for environmental science careers, at federal officials learning traditional ecological practices, at a restored landscape that served as proof that cooperation between cultures could heal even the deepest wounds. "We rescued each other," she said simply. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Victoria reflected on how a single moment of courage, reaching out to save a drowning girl, had transformed into something much larger. Traditional knowledge was now formally recognized in federal environmental policy. Indigenous communities had new tools to protect their sacred places, and somewhere, other young people were discovering that their heritage wasn't something to escape from, but something to build upon. The river flowed clean and strong through the forest, carrying the story of healing toward future generations who would inherit a world where ancient wisdom and modern science worked together to protect what mattered most. Some rescues, Victoria realized, continued long after the drowning person reached safety. The best ones transformed not just individuals, but entire communities, entire systems, entire ways of understanding what it meant to save each other. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.